Hi, I'm Krista White, and I'm going to be presenting Does Military Necessity Override Medical Ethics? My stance is no. Medical ethics are the moral guidelines that designate professional ethical behavior in those in the medical field toward their patients, each other, and society as a whole. These standards originate from ancient Greek physician Hippocrates' belief that the goal of the medical profession is to relieve suffering and promote well-being in the relationship of fidelity with the patient. The International Code of Medical Ethics per the World Medical Association includes many guidelines. Some I'd like to point out are: report those physicians who either are practicing unethically or incompetently, are fraudulent or deceptive, respect patient confidentiality, and not enter any abusive or exploitative relationship with the patient. The importance of medical ethics is that these institutional approaches to biomedical ethics prevent healthcare practitioners from relying on their own personal beliefs or approaches to handling the ethical dilemmas that they face, which is subjective. These are based on a principled standard, which are more objective. Medical ethics require physicians to act in the best interest of the patient and to prioritize the patient's well-being above their own interests. Above all else, these standards exist to protect the human rights and dignity of patients while alleviating their suffering. So some history includes the Nuremberg Code that was the result of Nazi physicians being discovered as carrying out human experiments that were deadly and torturous in the hopes of benefiting the German military. So the Nuremberg Code set parameters regarding human experimentation during research as a result. The Geneva Convention was an international agreement that took place to establish the principle that the sick, wounded, medical personnel, facilities, and transport should be considered neutral in times of war. They also expanded upon this convention with additional ones that included treatment related to prisoners of war, hostage taking, torture, and discrimination. The wounded or sick of any side of conflict must be treated humanely, cared for, and protected. The use of moral or physical coercion is forbidden, specifically referring to using tactics in extracting information. The U.S. was one of the countries that agreed with this. More recently, the Guantanamo Bay detainees from the War on Terror under the Bush administration were described as being unlawful combatants rather than prisoners of war, which basically was used to circumvent their rights that they would have been entitled to under the Geneva Convention. But the International Committee of the Red Cross did reject this claim and made sure that they were entitled to their full rights. Should military physicians' priority be detainee welfare or government interests? These are two of the main focuses on both sides of the argument. So, our doctors were serving as medical care in the military limited from serving our country's best interests and needs by being bound by international human rights protections, such as those designated by the Geneva Conventions? And does the interest of our government include using physicians to manipulate detainees via their medical knowledge? And if so, is this torture or a human rights injustice? So arguments in favor of military necessity overriding medical ethics include that by Michael Gross from Levine's text, who claims that combatants lose their right to life as they gain the right to kill by participating in combat during wartime. It nullifies their right to life. He argues that this also means that enemy combatants' right to medical care is negated since their right to life is negated, and it is suspended until they are injured and unable to pose a threat anymore. And once they are rehabilitated to the point of being able to pose a threat, then they are once again an enemy soldier who has lost their right to life or medical care. So that's one point he makes. Another is that about salvageability, and that even when it comes to our own friendly soldiers, that we do rank who is most and least likely to survive based on resources that we have, who is going to be most able to survive without taking up the most amount of resources. So sometimes physicians may have to forego treating somebody who is not likely going to live. He also claims that non-combatants and innocent people's lives are restricted by being restricted to medical care during war, and that they could be harmed as collateral damage but not necessarily treated due to military needs or scarcity of resources. So, in opposition of military necessity overriding medical ethics, Bloch and Mark from Levine's text argue that Doctors who prioritize military needs are denying their status as physicians because the therapeutic mission is their primary role and the core of their professional identity. Profession and preservation of this mission and identity requires boundaries regarding human behavior. Some of these boundaries including not using any drugs or any other tactics to extract information from enemy combatants, interrogation involvement other than protecting the detainees' safety, and failure to document and report abuses are violations as well. They may not be torture, but they are still considered unethical. Physicians who help develop and execute aggressive counter-resistance plans or torture are in violation of the Geneva Contract laws, which explicitly state that prisoners of war may not be subjected to any mode of torture or coercion, or exposed to any unpleasant treatment if they refuse to answer questions. This also is further backed up by the Tokyo Declaration that stated that military physicians who are even simply just present during any episode of abuse or inhumane treatment of detainees are in violation. Jerome A. Singh feels that doctors who feel conflicted between their duty as physicians and patriotic duty must consider their legal and ethical obligations to the former and advocate for the legal and ethical rights that have been declared for detainees. So my first argument is backed by the deontological reasoning against this military override. So Kant's moral reasoning was founded by the idea that all human lives are inherently and intrinsically valuable, and that with his categorical imperative that one should act only according to the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So only do something and it is only good if it could be universally applied as good. So I see that as a major conflict here because the physician placing military interests above the medical ethics they agreed to uphold are a violation of ethical principles and therefore immoral. The lives of these detainees that the military wants physicians to either neglect or harm are not being valued as worthy or inherently worthy of respect or dignity, and are being used as a means alone instead of a means to an end. They're just being used as a means to obtain information with no regard for their well-being. This would be along the maxim of human lives can be disregarded if it means benefiting military interests. So that would obviously not be good if it was universally applied, because what if it was the enemy saying that about our troops? Like, we would totally be against them torturing and trying to coerce our troops with these harmful tactics. Kant also emphasized how duty was key in morality. We ought to do things because it's the right thing to do, so we need to uphold our duty. A physician takes an oath that it's their duty to protect and save human lives. So how are they doing that if they're letting these detainees die or get harmed or be tortured? Like, that's not universally upholding this duty, and they're not acting within any universal maxim, again, because it's only when it benefits them or the interests of those that they are working for. Kant also believed in retribution. So he might not be against necessarily detaining somebody who's trying to harm everybody else, because he did believe in punishment, but he believed that punishment should fit the crime. So if being tortured infinitely is much worse than death, that would be going above and beyond the crime that these detainees allegedly committed, and once again would be immoral in that way. My second argument is backed by Aristotle's virtue ethics. And we know these are founded on the basis that goodness of character is what makes a person and their action good. Virtues are the mean between extreme and characteristics and are virtuous through being consistent in habitual actions. So, doctors ignoring the human rights of these detainees in favor of military interests are violating the virtues of justice, fairness, compassion, benevolence, reasonableness, and honesty, to name a few. Instead, they're acting out of self-interest, engagement, disengagement, malevolence, and dishonor, and so on. So even if they're not intending to willfully harm these detainees by neglecting them or whatever else they are doing, they are still considered to be in the moral wrong, because while Aristotle did consider intention as part of virtue of thought process, it's not what determines if an action is good or bad. What determines that is the end result. And if the end result is somebody being abused or harmed or killed or, just going against their ethics and virtues of, like, justice and fairness and compassion and benevolence, for example, like, that is no longer being of good moral character. It's a bad moral, it's not a moral action, and it's meaning that the physician is now of bad moral character. As well as doctors foregoing these virtues in favor of the claim that it has to be done for the sake of the military. It's not being congruent with the oaths that they took as doctors and physicians when they first started their profession. So they're being deceitful and dishonorable and showing a lapse of consistency in any virtue they were previously displaying, which goes against the firm and unchangeable character that Aristotle spoke of. So even if somebody did try to argue that these physicians did have the virtue of loyalty or something along those lines because they are trying to remain loyal to the country when they are letting these abuses happen to detainees, that's not the case because, like argued by J and S Rachels in their book, a trait of virtue deployed for an evil cause means that one character is on the whole wicked or bad. So in this case, yes, it would be an evil cause to be loyal for the sake of just benefiting the military's intelligence, and you're going to torture another human being or diminish their quality of life. It's done unjustly and without compassion with the detainee, so therefore it is not moral behavior. So through Kant's deontological ethics and Aristotle's virtue ethics, we can see that military override of medical ethics is not a good thing, is not moral, it's not ethical, and it should not be considered as a legal or beneficial practice. Thank you.